Waiting. Ladies, have you ever had to wait for your husband? Oh, what about you men? Have you had to wait for your wives? Oh, there's a bit more noise there. What about when she's getting dressed? Does that take longer than you take? Oh, come on. Or doing your hair? That doesn't take long, does it? Huh? What about waiting? What I don't like is when you come into a queue and you take a number. You're not a name, you're just a number. I don't like it. And when you get a number at Service News, well, even if you go to Macca's, they'll give a number, and it's 165, and they've just called 141. And your next one's 142, and it comes up slowly, and you wait and you wait. What an experience when you have to wait. But you know, today I want to tell you, Jesus waited. We can wait in queues, in traffic, all sorts of ways. But let me tell you about a great time. This was back before most of you were born. I think these other mics are on, are they? 1916 it was, in April. Sir Ernest Shackleton was on his trip to the South Pole. His ship was immobilised and he couldn't get out. They were on Elephant Island. There were 27 men and they couldn't get out, and there was only one way. Shackleton said, I must take this little lifeboat, the John Caird, and with 4 others row for 1,500 kilometres in the Southern Ocean to Georgia Island, and there get another ship to come and rescue you. So they said goodbye, 24th of April, 1916. The 22 left there waited each day for 4.5 months. Something like 135 days. And as they waited, they had to be ready because the boat might come at any time, and they had to get out before the ice would close in again. Finally, after that heroic effort to get to Georgia, Shackleton and his 4 others managed to find another boat, and they came back and rescued them, waiting 4.5 months. Wow. But today I want to talk about Jesus waiting. And Jesus was accused of blasphemy. I want to take you to John chapter 10. And there's a verse in 10 that says, how long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us. Plainly, Jesus replied, I have already told you, and you don't believe me. The proof is the work I do in my Father's name. Well, that really got under their skin. Because if you look at the next verse, a couple of verses down, verse 32, they took up stones to stone him, and they said, we're stoning you not for any good work, but for blasphemy. You can heal all the people you like, but because you said that God was your Father and that you were God, that's why we're stoning you. You're a mere man and you claim to be God. Wow. What do you do in this case? Jesus, he just withdrew and he went off for quite a long walk. In fact, if you look at the map here, you can see Jerusalem, and Bethany is just over the hill from Jerusalem. This thing has come off my ear. And down past the Jordan, there is another Bethany. It's about 60 kilometres away. And you go from Jerusalem right down. The Dead Sea is hundreds of feet below sea level. So you go right down and you come over past Jericho, over the Jordan, and here he was in Bethany. Jesus withdrew. He would be stoned in Jerusalem. His time wasn't there, and so he goes down there. Now, I want you to think. He's over there, but he's got his best friends up in Bethany near Jerusalem. I've walked to Bethany. It's over the hill behind the Mount of Olives. It's not that far away. Today, it's in the other side. There's a big wall in between today because you have the division between Jerusalem and the other West Bank areas, and Bethany just happens to come in that. But back in there is Lazarus. Lazarus, of course, was the place, it was his motel when he came to Jerusalem. You're always welcome here. Mary and Martha and Lazarus, they're there. Home here, there's always a bed for you. And Jesus often stayed there in the home of Lazarus. But while he's down at Bethany over the Jordan, 60 kilometres away, and if you were walking, that would take you at least 2 days, maybe a third, but at least 2. And he went down there, and while he's down there, Lazarus starts to get sick, and sicker, and sicker. He's not well at all. Mary and Martha say, what can we do? So there's only one thing they can do. In John 11 verse 3, the 2 sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is sick. They didn't ask him to come. They knew he would come. The message goes, someone would have walked those 2 days across the Jordan, found where Jesus is, and delivered the message. Lord, your dear friend is sick. Well, the disciples thought, he's going to go back because this friend of his, Lazarus, was a specially close friend. But Jesus made this comment to the messenger who came, and he said, this sickness will not end in death, but for the glory of God. So the messenger takes this message, walks the 2 days back up to Bethany near Jerusalem, and gives the message to Mary and Martha that Jesus said it won't end in death, but at least for the glory of God. Time goes on. And it wasn't very good. To the disciples, the next 2 days, there's a verse that tells me there was disappointment back up in Bethany because Lazarus dies. If you were Mary and Martha and you just got a message from Jesus say, this sickness will not end in death. Here he is dead. What would you think? Was the message true? Did the messenger hear it right? Well, what does he mean? Because he's dead. Absolutely. What a disappointment. But to the disciples, Jesus stays 2 days. The next 2 days, he doesn't even mention Lazarus once. The disciples are saying, hey, did he really love Lazarus? What's the story? He got the message. He said it won't end in death, and he hasn't even talked about him. Now, isn't that strange? They said, we can't make it out. Maybe he didn't love him as much as we thought he did. 2 days. He just waits on. The other fellow had walked back up the 2 days. Now 2 days is gone. Wow. You know, the Pharisees and the priests, they'd come to the disciples of Jesus and they said, if Jesus is who he is, over there across the Jordan, John the Baptist was in prison and he lost his head. And you say he can heal people. Why did he let John the Baptist die? If he is who he is, why couldn't he have stopped that? And if you were the disciples, how can you answer? There's no answer. And the priest said, he's not who he says he is. That's why. Well, 2 days goes on. Jesus waits. The delay is a mystery to the disciples. But then Jesus says, let's go. But can you think Mary and Martha, during that time, they're waiting and waiting. Lazarus is getting sicker. He's getting near, then he dies. What would you think of them? Can you be in their position? What would you say? Well, finally Jesus says to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. But his disciples, they objected. One of them said, hey, don't you remember? They tried to stone you. They'll kill you. You're going back there. That's not the place to go. Jesus said, let's go. Let's go back to Judea. There is one point that comes very clearly to me here. It's always safe when you're doing the will of God. Always. Doesn't matter what God asked you to do, you're safe if you're doing the will of God. And so the disciples said, well, if you're going, we'll go too, and we'll die with you. But they'll go with him. But if you are doing the will of God, you are always safe. That's important to remember. Well, Jesus then said to his disciples, well, our friend Lazarus, he's fallen asleep. So I'm going to wake him up. And they said, well, if he's asleep, he'll do well. No. Lazarus is dead. Jesus waited until Lazarus died. How do you reconcile that with his message that this sickness won't end in death? And he's dead. And Jesus said he's dead. But he also said it will be for the glory of God. Jesus waited those 2 days. And a very clear message comes from Jesus that death is plainly asleep. Nothing more than asleep. Lazarus was sleeping. But there's something else. When Jesus thought of his disciples, when he thought of Lazarus and Mary and Martha, there is a message there. Jesus never forgets his suffering friends, even with the deepest disappointment. And if disappointment comes to you, remember, Jesus knows all about it. He hasn't forsaken you. He'll be with you through it, and he'll go through it with you. He never forgets his friends, even with the deepest disappointment. And if you've had disappointments, you've got to remember, Jesus is with you there. Well, they start walking. And they walk all the way back up the hills till they get to Bethany. And you say, well, why on earth did Jesus wait? Couldn't he have come and saved Lazarus and kept him alive? Because if Jesus had been there, Lazarus would not have died. No question of that. He wouldn't have died had Jesus been there. But he'd waited those 2 extra days. And then he has to walk back up the hills to Lazarus and find that he's been buried. Jesus said to his disciples, it's for your sakes I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. Now he's dead. Isn't that telling you something? Let's go see him. That's not what you normally do after 4 days to get up there. But it's telling you what Jesus can do and what he will do. And he said, I'm glad I wasn't there for your sakes. And it was for the sake of Mary and Martha as well as disciples. And it's for your sake as well. yours and mine. Jesus waited. Well, I want you to think of the reaction. Lazarus, he's going down and down. The promise is, well, Jesus has said it won't end in death, but then he closed his eyes. His last thought, why didn't Jesus come? What about the sisters? And they're seeing their dear brother die before their eyes. And if Jesus had been here, why hasn't he come? We sent a message to him. We thought he loved us. And the disciples, they couldn't understand the mystery, why he waited. But he waited for them, and he's waited for us as well. I'll come back to the priest in a moment. Remember, Jesus loved them no less because he waited. And he loves us no less today because he's still waiting for us all to be together in his kingdom. His love doesn't depend on time, whether it's waiting or not. Here's a thought I read from Desire of Ages. To all who are reaching out to feel the guiding hand of God, the moment of greatest discouragement is the time when divine help is nearest. If you've got a discouragement, God is right there with you. He's in it with you. The greatest, you think nothing else can be, God says, that's when divine help is nearest. And it's for you and for me today as well. Jesus gets back to Bethany. He's walked those extra 2 or 3 days up the hill. He comes to the outside of the village and he stands on the edge of the village. He doesn't go into the house where Mary and Martha and all the friends have come. Priests have come. Everyone has come. Lazarus was well known. And they're wailing in there, and Mary and Martha are there. And he stands at the edge of the village. And finally, someone sees Jesus and they go and they whisper, Martha, Jesus, he's come out to the village. And she just quietly exits the house and goes there. And this is her point. Lord, if only you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Have you ever played the if only game? If only. Maybe some of you have said, if only I studied more in school. If only I'd eaten more healthfully. If only I'd done my exercise. Or if you're in school, if only I'd done my homework. If only. Martha says, you would have been here. He wouldn't have died if only you had been here. You know, both those sisters said the same thing. If only you'd been here. If only. Have you ever played it? Do you do it now? Do you realize God is still with you? Because that's what this story is all about. There is an answer, and Jesus had the answer. And he says to those sisters there in verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. New Living Translation. You will live. If you believe in me, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus used this title of God about 7 times. I am the water of life. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the door. I am the shepherd. I am. And he said, before Abraham was, I am. And this is the I am who is saying, I am the resurrection and the life. If you believe in me, this will be for the glory of God. Interesting. The great I Am is speaking. And then the Bible has the shortest verse in the Bible. Anyone who's been trying to memorize verses from the Bible, this was a favourite of Junior's. Jesus wept. That's all the verse says. Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible. But he didn't weep for Lazarus. He knew that Lazarus would be brought to life. And soon when Jesus rode into Jerusalem down from that Mount of Olives on the back of a little donkey, Lazarus would lead him. So he wasn't crying for Lazarus. And he wasn't even crying for Mary and Martha. But his heart was pierced with the rejection that a lot of humanity would give for him. He felt, these people are rejecting me. I know what's going to happen for them. Jesus wept. Here are the priests all around him. They've all come out round to the grave of Lazarus. They've accused him of blasphemy. He said, my Father, and I work for my Father. I am the resurrection and the life. And so the priests are there. And he's sorry for them too, for they have rejected him. The reason for the delay. Why did he wait those 4 days? He says, let's go and look. They said, no, look, don't open it. He's been dead 4 days. Now, up until now, every time Jesus raised someone, Jairus' daughter, nobleman's son, any of them, the widow from Nain, her son, they said, oh, they weren't really dead. They just came back. They were just sleeping. They were just not dead, but they were just out, and they came back to, yeah. But this time, Jesus says, none of you, no one will be able to put that, because here is proof beyond doubt. He's been dead for 4 days. We all know he was buried there. The reason for the delay. And so he raised his hand and prays to his Father and says, Father, I thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. He's now claiming again his divinity, his association with God the Father. And he says, but I say this out loud so that they will believe that you sent me. Here is the reason. Why did Jesus wait? Here is proof that can never be denied that Jesus is divine. And it was for the priests, it was for Mary and Martha, it was for the disciples, because he said to them, you will believe because of this. And so he waits 2 extra days before he goes back to Jerusalem. The reason for the delay. So that your faith, when you take this book and read the story of Jesus, you have no doubt whatsoever who he is and what he's done and what he can do and what he will do for you. I thank you, Lord, because they will believe that you've sent me. Unassailable evidence. Evidence that can never be misinterpreted. This is the crowning miracle of Jesus' life. It was indisputable proof that he was divine. And here they are gathered around the tomb in Bethany. The priests are there. They've accused him of blasphemy. And they're waiting. What is going to happen? Can he do this? Will he do it? I guess they're a little fearful that he will. And they wait until Jesus shouts, Lazarus, come forth! This is Jesus, and there is movement in the tomb. The stone's been rolled away, and out comes this figure draped in grave clothes. And he says, loose him. Let him go. The crowning miracle. Unassailable evidence. These priests could never say a thing again. This man is not a man. He must be God. This was the proof for the disciples. It was the proof for the priests. And it's proof for you and me today that you and I can know who Jesus is and what he can do. Jesus had now fully made manifest his control over death and the grave. That mighty miracle was the crowning evidence offered by God to men that he had sent his Son into the world for their salvation. It was a demonstration of divine power sufficient to convince every mind that was under the control of reason and an enlightened conscience. That's why he waited, so that you and I can believe, so the priest could have unassailable evidence, so his disciples would say, he is who he said he is, and we can believe. Our hope is solid. It has an absolute basis. It was attested by so many. The crowd from Jerusalem, all there in Bethany on that day, they all saw it. None of them could gainsay this crowning evidence of Jesus' divinity. He is who he said he is. He is the I am that has existed from eternity and will exist for eternity. Why did he wait? For Lazarus and his sisters, of course. For the priests and the crowd, certainly. But he also waited for you and for me, absolutely. Here is proof beyond any shadow of doubt that your faith in him will hold and will be rewarded for eternity. There are 7 lessons from me I've mentioned. We're always safe when doing the will of God. Jesus never forgets us when we have disappointments or suffering, and we all do, but he never forgets us. He loves us no less if he waits and death intervenes. And some of us who aren't quite as young as we used to be, that might be a real promise. The raising of Lazarus is absolute proof of his divinity. And plainly, death is just asleep. Our hope is solid. It has an absolute basis. It's attested by so many. And the raising of Lazarus means everything to us today. Jesus used this crowning miracle, to portray that his rise from the tomb would be just as significant. People would say, well, if he was a God, he came out as a God. But no, he can raise you and he can raise me from the dead. He's in charge. He said, I have the keys of hell and the grave. He's got it all, and he will use that. Soon the great I am is going to speak again. He said, I assure you, verily, verily. Truly, truly it means. The time is coming, indeed is here now, when the dead will hear my voice, the voice of the Son of God. And those who listen will live. The Father has life in himself, and he's granted that same life-giving power to his Son. Soon the great I am is going to speak again. As he returns from heaven, there will be the greatest resurrection ever. His resurrection is one that just tells us, again, this is sure. He came out of the grave himself. Up from the grave he arose. But he also brought Lazarus. He brought others when he came forth. And he'll bring you and me. Remember why Jesus waited, so that you can know with absolute certainty who he is, what he's doing, and he's coming for you. Okay. God bless you as you sing this last hymn that reminds you of his mighty power. Thank you, Lord, that you have waited to show that there is evidence unassailable that we can believe that you are who you are. You came forth from the grave. You brought Lazarus from the grave. But Father, in all of our disappointments here, we know that you're right beside us, and we wait for that time when you again will say, all will come forth from the grave, because you are the great I am. Father, may this hope burn in our hearts until we see you, and may that be soon. In Jesus' name. Amen.